June 2020, when our world turned upside down and the news, medical leaders, and politicians betrayed our trust, one voice cut through the chaos.
Hydroxychloroquine cuts risk of hospitalization in half, more than half.
And spoke for the silent majority of medical doctors and researchers, too afraid of retribution to speak for themselves.
Dr. Fauci has been maintaining that only randomized, controlled, double-blinded trials provide evidence worth relying upon to decide whether a medication works. That is a standard that has never been imposed neither by the FDA nor by the scientific community in general.
Has Dr. Fauci ever called you and asked you your opinion and why you have the opinion that you do?
No.
3 years later, Broken Truth presents an interview with an American hero, Dr. Harvey Risch.
With Broken Truth, this is John Davidson and Clinton Ohlers, and today we have Harvey Risch, MD and PhD, who is a professor emeritus and senior research scientist in epidemiology for chronic diseases at Yale Institute for Global Health. Welcome, Dr. Risch.
Thank you. Somehow the global health thing seems to have pervaded everywhere, but really it's Yale School of Public Health.
Okay, good to know. So, Dr. Risch, you have been a major force, especially in my life, for bringing me into this entire fight, this crazy thing that our world has kind of gotten sucked into. It was actually an interview I think that you did with CNN, or maybe it was actually no, I think it was a Newsweek article that you wrote. Was that correct?
Probably the Newsweek article that came about from the paper that I did in the American Journal of Epidemiology on evidence for efficacy and safety of hydroxychloroquine in outpatient treatment.
You know, at that point in time, we had just dealt with the Surgisphere issue, and it was so obviously, thrown under the rug that most people like me that were starting to ask questions, we didn't have any resources that we could pull from to justify or validate our concerns. And so here comes this article from you, and it was just like, thank you. And so I reached out to you, and that's kind of how I started down this path of advocacy and journalism, which I had sort of walked away from 20 years ago. So then after that, were you part of the group of doctors that went to the Lancet New England Journal of Medicine and submitted a complaint about the Surgisphere study?
Actually, no. There was 200 other doctors who had discovered the absurdity of what was being represented as original data in that study.
What made you decide to leave the safety of the hallowed halls of Yale and speak out publicly? And did you know when you did it that it was going to put you under such scrutiny?
Well, I'm a lifelong scientist. In fact, my parents said I was a scientist by age 3 because I wanted to know how everything worked. And that characterizes me in the search for how nature works. And I'm just not willing to lie about what nature says. If scientific evidence stands on its own merits and one represents it as truthfully and objectively as possible, and that's been my 40-plus year career, and there isn't anything else. There's no reason to do anything else. And so when I wrote the findings that I had about hydroxychloroquine in the original analysis from May of 2020, that just seemed straightforward to me. And why shouldn't this be the right thing to do? And why shouldn't this medication work? And there were doctors who were already using it, and it was working extraordinarily well. And so, in my somewhat naive understanding of the pandemic at that point, I thought all we had to do was use it. So why not use it? It's cheap, safe, effective. Let's get going. And of course, then the pushback started. And at first I thought it was just reporters being reporters and getting things wrong, which, I've spent 40 years talking about my research studies. And I typically tell reporters, oh, by the way, I'll be happy to review the content, before you put it out. If you want, I can maybe add things here or there, which is my way of saying, I'll check to make sure that you actually represent what I said and not what, something you've changed. And so I just thought it was reporters being sloppy and not understanding things. But then it began to be systematic and fraudulent. When you had studies of hospital patients claiming that hydroxychloroquine didn't work for hospital patients, and then reporters saying, therefore, it doesn't work at all, and this was being done repeatedly, I recognized that there was a systematic problem going on, and that this was not about hydroxychloroquine, it was something larger. And that made me angry, actually, because it's obvious that this drug works and would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives had it been widely employed, and could have been, and there was the national strategic stockpile of the medication, which still exists, which could have been easily rolled out and employed, and that this was suppressed became apparent that it was part of a campaign to do something else. And what we've learned over the 3 years or so now was what that campaign actually was, and whose interests were being served and what it was for.
Dr. Risch, you were very instrumental, actually even in my own career, in moving into reporting on what was going on in the pandemic. And this is something I'd love for you to get at, was why so much the medical community came out against this on the basis of fraudulent and misguided studies that really led, I would say, the rest of the academic world astray.
Well, two things play into that. First of all, the medical community that you refer to is academic medicine. Academic medicine, by and large, treated no outpatients with COVID and had no expertise in this. Their expertise is in hospital treatments and specialization treatments. So they were not treating the first line patients who got sick symptomatic with COVID, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. And so they were espousing authority without actually having it in the particular question at hand, which is the use of this and these medications when patients first get sick as outpatients before they get hospitalized, if that's what happens to them. And so they had no authority, and yet they were pretending to authority on that basis. Furthermore, they had no experience. And third, they were being paid to take the side against this medication by pharma, because many, many, many of them have large pharma grants. They carry out randomized trials for pharma. They go on speaking engagements for pharma. Pharma's MO around the world in big pharma is to co-opt as much of the medical and journal space as possible to protect their marketing. And what it costs to market a new successful drug is $1 billion to research the drug, evidence of its utility and safety. This costs that much because 99% of drugs that are tried end up failing for one reason or another. And so it takes a lot of work to come up with a successful one. And that can be easily $1 billion. But then pharma spends $2 billion in marketing this. That $2 billion goes to supplying grants and salaries and consulting and all sorts of monies to doctors in hospitals all over the world, as well as to supporting advertising in lay and medical media all over the world in order to protect pharma interests. You can understand that a journal that has to pay its editors and its editorial staff and so on, that can't make all of its money on article submission fees, has to raise money and does it by advertising and becomes addicted to the advertising. And once that happens, which happens fairly quickly, then the journal has to kowtow, or the publisher of the journal has to kowtow to the interests of pharma, and those interests are very clearly expressed and feed down into the editors themselves. And Horton at Lancet and Marcia Angel at New England Journal all talked about this in their books and comments about the effects of pharma on medical publishing. And so those interests are all over the world and widespread, and reflect a field where objective information is not available because it's suppressed in the interest of pharma in marketing patent medications. And that's why hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, other generic medications that are cheap, relatively cheap compared to the patent medications, have no chance of getting pushed in a time when pharma sees the opportunity to make gigantic amounts of money off of their patent medications and vaccines.
Wow. Now, Marcia Angel, who you just referred to, she was, as I understand, an over 20-year editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and she wrote what you referred to back in 2002, which is over 20 years ago now. So this problem has clearly been going on for well over 2 decades.
That's right. This is not something new. It just metastasized, I think, in the last 3 years, or it became much more obvious how detrimental it was in the so-called crisis of the pandemic. And but I think it happens in many other journals, especially the clinical journals. The more medical clinical advertising you see in a journal, the worse it is. And even lay newspapers and magazines that are supported by pharma ads still have to comply with limiting what can be spoken of in those media to what pharma is willing to tolerate. And the other interesting thing is those pharma ads are not just for information for patients. They actually serve a more important function for pharma, which is that little disclaimer at the end spoken of at 1.75 speed or 2 speed with all the negative things that might happen. That is a legal statement of pharma to doctors, informing doctors who will use these medications what they have to know in order to be legally compliant with the requirements of marketing. And that means that doctors are assumed to be informed, and pharma gets this informing process through those quotes at the bottom of these ads or at the ends of the ads on TV, for example. And so pharma is actually paying for control of the media and three things, and getting the advertising to patients and supplying the information to doctors for legal purposes.
It seems, from what I understand, that it's gotten so bad that if you look at some of the trials on hydroxychloroquine, like the Recovery trial, the Solidarity trial, and I believe a third trial that occurred in Brazil, if it's not one of those two, where they actually overdosed the patients with hydroxychloroquine. Comparatively, with ivermectin, in order to kill that drug, you had studies. Dr. Boulware at the University of Minnesota was involved in these, that underdosed with ivermectin, making it borderline ineffective. And when you actually have like randomized control trials and other levels of studies at very high levels going out designed with that kind of result, I mean, it really looks like murder by means of randomized control trial. Is that, what's your opinion on that? Yeah.
The randomized controlled trial misrepresentation has been a problem since 1991 when the term evidence-based medicine was coined. I thought that was an affront to medicine and medical research, as if to say there has been no evidence prior to 1991 about the efficacy of everything we know in medical literature about medications and treatments and vaccines and whatever, that suddenly only randomized trials are presumed to be knowledgeable and providing evidence. That's absurd. And the reason it's absurd is people see the word randomized and think, oh, it's perfect. It's a gold standard. It's the only kind of evidence on which to be relied. Nothing could be further from the truth. And the reason that plausibility succeeds is because people don't understand the central limit theorem and law of large numbers in statistics. And so the problem is that randomized trials are too small. And even, for example, the study of the Pfizer vaccine that involved 22,000 people in the treatment group and 22,000 people in the control group, those were too small. And the reason they're too small is because in the treatment group, there were only 8 people with COVID as the outcomes. Think of it this way. If you flip a coin 10 times, you're very liable to get 7 heads and 3 tails or vice versa by chance. And 7 versus 3 is more than a twofold difference. That twofold difference in a randomized trial will bias the results dramatically. And so if you only have 8 outcomes in one arm of a trial, it's not randomized. Those 8 outcomes could have been 6 males and 2 females or something like that by chance. Whereas in all the other 22,000 in each group, it would have been much closer to 50-50. The problem is in flipping a coin 10 times, you can get 7 versus 3. But in flipping a coin 100 times, you are exceedingly unlikely to get 70 versus 30, the same ratio. You're much more likely to get 50-50. And so the problem with randomized trials is they're not designed to reduce what we call confounding, this bias in the relationship between the treatment and the outcome based on some extraneous or other factor that's not measured in the trial. You cannot get rid of it without having large numbers of outcome events. And none of these trials, all the Boulware studies, if you look at their numbers of hospitalizations and deaths, they're negligible. They're very, very, very small numbers, sometimes 0, 1, 2, and so on. those are the only outcomes that are worth anything. I really don't care, and most patients don't care whether they have an extra day or two of symptoms. They want to know that they're not going to die from this illness. That's what matters. And so if you go to the Bulwer studies and Skipper and all the others that the Minnesota group put out, you'll see that their outcomes of importance, hospitalization and mortality, are exceedingly small numbers. And therefore, the randomization was worthless in those trials. They didn't adjust for anything in those trials to deal with the fact that they had weak randomization. And so this is all sham. Those studies are all sham. They have the look, the claim, the plausibility claim, they're randomized trials. But what they are is sham evidence. And that's been the problem, that this randomized controlled trial sham has been around in evidence-based medicine, which is largely pharma-controlled, since 1991. And it's made the representation of medical evidence the opposite of what evidence-based medicine is supposed to represent. That if you're looking for scientific evidence, you have to actually evaluate the nature of the scientific evidence. And that means understanding that randomization takes a lot more subjects than you think it does.
What's going on with the peer review process? Like, I mean, we're talking the New England Journal of Medicine, Journal of the American Medical Association, the Lancet. I mean, to my understanding, those are the top 3 medical journals in the world. And these studies are getting through peer review, and it seems like they shouldn't be.
Well, peer review has always been subjective. I think that if journals required peer reviewers to supply references to the points that they make criticizing journal article submissions, then nobody would review the manuscripts, because it takes a lot of work, and it's a lot of work as it is just to read and comment on manuscripts. And so I think that there's a lot of room for subjectivity to enter in. Editors can choose reviewers that they know have proclivities and biases to slant the review process. And then you have the pressure on the journals to, even with positive reviews, editors choosing not to publish. A paper that I worked on with colleagues in Brazil was accepted on hydroxychloroquine and other medications for early outpatient treatment, was accepted by the journal, and then did not get final approval for 4 months. It just sat there with the editor for 4 months, who was apparently either debating whether to accept it, even though the reviewers said it was publishable, or I don't know why it sat there, but it sat for, after the reviews came back, we were told it was accepted, and then it sat there for 4 months before it moved on to publication. All of this stuff was happening behind the scenes, and it's made medical reviewing and medical research now Wild West. And so a lot of papers are put in preprint servers, medRxiv, and the various other preprint serving services on the internet. And even those are not without corruption, that their editors are also supported by agencies and funders who have axes to grind, so to speak, in this process. And so even that's not totally objective, but at least it's allowing for more to get out that people can review. But it's making everybody read and criticize to themselves every paper that comes out, rather than relying on so-called objective reviewers.
Dr. Zelenko, in an interview with Dr. Drew, mentioned the New England Journal of Medicine changed its focus away from epidemiological research to more data-driven. Can you sort of expand on that and sort of explain how that happened, what went down there?
I can't speak to that exactly, but I will say that nobody understands what's scientific about epidemiology, and not even most epidemiologists, let alone doctors, statisticians, geneticists, lab scientists, and so on. When I was teaching for 30 years, I taught advanced epidemiologic research methods to doctoral students and some MPH students. And at the beginning of the first class, I would ask them, what's scientific about epidemiology? And inevitably, they would say, we talk about person, place, and time, which means the descriptive aspects of diseases. And I'd say, no, that's descriptive. It's not scientific. What's scientific? And never got an answer. And the essence of what is scientific about epidemiology is that we want to talk about what causes diseases. So we want to say the disease as a whole. We want to talk about a population as a whole where the disease occurs. But we can't study everybody in the population, and we can't study everybody with the disease. And so we sample people with diseases, and we sample people from the population, and we measure them on various things of interest to look for causation. That sampling process is fraught with biases and confounding, as I mentioned. And so if we obsess about bias in our sampling process, and the whole point of sampling is to acquire people to study who are representative of the disease as a whole and representative of the population of interest as a whole. That representativeness and generalizability to the disease is what's scientific about epidemiology. And it's why we have all of our arcane things that we talk about in the field in order to make representative and generalizable conclusions from the samples of people that we enroll in our studies. And this is kind of passes over the heads of everybody who see epidemiology as, oh, you just get a handful of cases, you get a bunch of cases, you get a bunch of controls, and you compare them. That is the exact opposite of representativeness and generalizability. They don't see that because nobody's ever told them that that's what's the scientific essence of what epidemiology is about, at least the chronic disease epidemiology that I've done for most of my career. And so epidemiology, for that reason, has been not understood in clinical medicine, and therefore it has been devalued and thought of, oh, there's no science there, and oh, it's a stepchild science, and oh, it's not really important, and we're much more interested in clinical studies and randomized trials, which are obviously much more important, and all of this stuff, which is not scientifically accurate. So it's a bigotry, it's a bias against epidemiology that existed, and it was the reason why, aside from the American Journal of Epidemiology, which started, I think, in 1915, that numerous epidemiology journals sprung up in the 1960s, 70s, 80s because of this shabby treatment that the clinical journals were affording epidemiology because they didn't understand epidemiology in the first place.
So as you do your research into, the statistics and data that comes out, I'm assuming that you're using hospital data and things like that in your work
most of my work has been focused on my research work in COVID on outpatient treatment. I've done that on my own and in collaboration with Peter McCullough, with Zev Zelenko when he was alive, and others, to look at various drugs and factors and non-prescription supplements and so on that are useful in treating COVID, are useful perhaps in sequelae, long-term signs and symptoms. I think that's been one of the major areas of focus for me. The other, of course, is vaccines, benefits and harms from vaccines, looking at those data across countries, within countries, and so on, has also been a focus of study for me during the pandemic.
I guess, yeah, where I'm going with this is what we've seen is that hospitals were calling anything COVID, because my understanding is that hospitals are often paid less than they bill for Medicare and Medicaid and things like that, and insurance. So let's say, you submit a bill for $10,000 to Medicare, they will pay maybe $5,000.
Or maybe 2,000, or
right.
It's astonishing how little Medicare will pay. That's right.
And so that's why when you go to get an MRI, your hospital or your insurance is charged $2,000 for an MRI. But if you go with cash to an independent facility, you can do it for $200. I've done this personally for my family members. So I'm very aware that there's an unusual discrepancy in just how the billing works. Can you speak to the fact that was COVID one of these rare billing types that the government paid full amount?
Well, I don't know what full amount actually is because, medical plans, large medical plans negotiate costs with providers that if you actually paid the cash amount that the provider billed, it could be 5 or 10 times what the medical plan pays. And the providers seem to be content with taking what insurance and medical plans pay. So the range of value for that. That's the range of payments for what has some intrinsic value is just, I don't see how it's a rational calculation. It's whatever anybody can get away with under negotiations between all the parties. And, with insurance, there's a middleman. The insurance company has to make money in addition to everything else. So I don't know how to look at that other than to understand that there were very severe incentives for the hospitals to make more money. Hospitals have always been a losing proposition because of the amount of inner city indigent care they provide basically for free. It used to be the federal government reimbursed that, and then the states were providing that, and then the states started cutting back, and so hospitals had to make up that income in order to support that unfunded care by other means, and so they overbilled for other things in order to make up for what they put out that they couldn't bill or couldn't get reimbursed for. And that's a problem, because then you have any incentive given to a hospital to make more money, they will take, because hospitals more or less feel desperate to keep themselves running under this perverted scheme of who's funding what. And so if you get $10,000 more by labeling a broken arm as COVID related, then that's what they do. It's shameless. And nobody's pushing back on that. Everybody is wink, wink, and that's what's happened. And so doing unnecessary procedures in hospitals, if the federal government is incentivizing that, then hospitals will do it. If the federal government is incentivizing people dying in hospitals because they're paying more money to hospitals when patients die than when they don't, then hospitals will either withhold life-saving care or they'll use risky care that has a plausibility function to it. So, for example, putting people on ventilators who are at very severe pneumonias from COVID was routine to do in the early part of the pandemic, even though it was exploding people's lungs because of the high pressure used in the ventilators. And this was unconscionable, and yet the hospitals were doing this routinely and making money from the federal government over it. So the federal government's incentives over this have been entirely corrupt and led to completely opposite behaviors from hospitals compared to what would be desirable for actual proper medical care.
They incentivized the killing of patients. And that's, if there should have been a bonus if the patient survived.
Well, right. You want to incentivize good outcomes, not bad outcomes.
With that in mind, if you're trying to build evidence-based medicine review of the statistics coming out of these hospitals, how can you even trust any of this data? I mean, if you have people motivated to put down COVID on an EHR, and that EHR then trickles down through to the billing, well, then it also goes to the CDC and the FDA, and they make their decisions based off of what they consider to be accurate. I mean, this is a whole perverted system. How can anyone trust any of the data?
Can I jump in with an example? Because I wrote an article that was retweeted by Pierre Corey. It went viral on Andrew Hill, right when the that famous Zoom call that got recorded between her and Tess Lowry came out, and Tess Lowry, publicized it. And the estimate that I had was when Andrew Hill was saying, well, just let me lay low on this for 6 weeks. Basically, it seemed to appease his funders. He wasn't going to come out in favor of ivermectin. He wanted 6 more weeks not to do it. And she's saying, yeah, but look at the death rate. They both were agreeing that it was be about an 80% survival rate if people had ivermectin. And so I ran the math on that based on the death rates for COVID at the time. And Andrew Hill was basically weighing, on one hand, over 500,000 people who would die during that period that could have been saved, right? That was the math that apparently he did in his head, and it was worth it to him for his funding. But when I say that, when I do that number, do we know that actually was the deaths, or were the deaths being over-reported to start with? It seems like a very tangled thing to unravel.
So unfortunately, we hardly know anything when you get to that level of precision of the information. I think at some point the British government was providing better data, but even that, once they realized that the data we're providing were counter the government messaging. They stopped providing the data. That was the end of March of 2022, I think. And that's the way it's been, that we really don't know the accuracy of everything. When CDC changed the coding of causes of death to push COVID up as a cause of death when it was a subsidiary cause, was already a corrupt act compared to CDC had established proper coding of death certificates for the previous 30 years. And there certainly were infectious diseases over the previous 30 years. And there was no reason to change anything just because you had a new infectious disease that could be causing people's deaths. But they changed it for a purpose, which is to be able to increase the fear in the population, which is what has been the driving force of the whole pandemic, which is that, in fact, one of the ways that you recognize about managing a pandemic is the case counts are irrelevant. What matters is the consequences of getting COVID, not the fact of getting COVID. Because most of the people who got COVID, so even in the early part of the pandemic, survived okay. Young people, people under age 50 or 60, who had no chronic health problems, weren't obese or diabetic and so on, basically survived COVID fine. It was older people and people with chronic conditions who had a harder time with it, and they were the ones who needed early treatment in particular. And so how you manipulate the pandemic and you manipulate fear in the population is by shrieking about cases. The cases are coming, the cases are coming, the sky is falling. And that is not how you manage a public health pandemic. You manage it by looking at the consequences of infections, meaning hospitalization, mortality, and perhaps long COVID, long viral disease, which long viral disease is common in other respiratory viruses, not just COVID. And so what does case counting and case reporting tell you? It's a way of making the population afraid and nothing more. That the pandemic is managed by looking at hospitalization numbers and death numbers. And once you can obfuscate those numbers, then you as the agency are in control of the messaging, and that's been where we've been at. So the whole thing has been a misrepresentation of using the case numbers as one of the vehicles for provoking fear in the population, because fear equals compliance with what the government was doing. And and this is all laid out and perfectly well established in public health practices. It was in the paper from 2005 or 2006 by Tom Inglesby and Don Henderson, who was the father of smallpox eradication, talking about all of the methods of public health management, things that we did the exact opposite in the COVID pandemic compared to what they laid out for flu respiratory virus illness pandemics back in 2005 or 2006. And we just done the opposite.
I did a story last week about, if you want to know who might have been behind an intentional pandemic, France in October of 2019 initiated a change of classification of hydroxychloroquine and I think paracetamol or Parames. What do you think about that?
Hydroxychloroquine for sure.
Mm-hmm.
The Minister of Health of France changed the status of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine from over-the-counter to prescription only, citing bogus genotoxicity claims, meaning that these medications supposedly damage genetic material in the body and therefore had to be restricted. And she did this, and it was published in January of 2020, but she made this decision in October or November of 2019. She did this in spite of the fact that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine had been used for more than 60 years in tens of billions of doses worldwide in hundreds of millions of people, in pregnant women, in infants, in children, elderly people with chronic diseases, uniformly without required electrocardiogram testing and so on, by doctors and over the counter all over the world, completely safely. This is one of the safest drugs known, with a very wide safety margin, that was used routinely all over the world for all of this massive dosing, and suddenly it became genotoxic. This was absurd. You have to address why she did that.
The timing is peculiar. Just especially that it took effect, I think, in mid-January of 2020, exactly at the moment when there was perhaps an interest in it, because I think February 4th, our scientists from Wuhan Institute of Virology submitted a paper to Nature, I believe, and stated that chloroquine was effective, more effective than remdesivir, which of course meant then we had to go out and push remdesivir and not chloroquine. From a geopolitical standpoint, I find that to be a smoking gun. And I'm wondering where else that kind of behavior was done, and what do these people know?
It's a good question. So the chloroquines were known to be effective against coronaviruses from 2005, a paper, and I think 2014 or 15, two papers were published in China, I believe, that looked at their usage in SARS and MERS and other coronaviruses, and showed that they were those medication, or chloroquine itself, was effective. The fact that this was being used in South Korea at the beginning of the pandemic, which is where Dr. Zelenko got the information from when he started using it, this was already known. People had this information. It wasn't just kind of hypothesized out of thin air. People had this information from decades of medical knowledge. It wasn't a huge amount of evidence, but it was enough to start using it and explore how well it worked, which it did. So this is where that came from. Now, you have to think about what the virology community in these respiratory viruses has been doing for the past 20 years, and why there was a gain-of-function moratorium during the Obama administration that was flouted by the researchers doing gain-of-function research, in particular the Ralph Barich's lab and Peter Daszak later through the Wuhan Institute of Virology by EcoHealth Alliance, his intermediary company. This viral research was done with the premise of saying our enemies are going to be making these bioterrorism agents, and so we have to do it in order to make vaccines, so we'll be able to counter this threat if and when it gets released on us. Now, you have to realize that there are two papers in 2015 and 2016 by Minatri and colleagues that come from, I believe it's Ralph Barich's lab, said that they were doing this gain-of-function research, and it had been approved, in the acknowledgments, it had been approved by NIH personnel during the time of the pause of gain-of-function research, meaning that this research had started before 2014, when the gain-of-function moratorium started in the Obama administration, and they applied for the ability to continue their research through that period, and NIH signed off on it, whether it was Fauci or one of his staff. They signed off on continuing this gain-of-function research. And in 2015, already reported on successfully engineering coronavirus to be able to infect human airway cells. Yet, from 2015 to 2019 or 2020, no vaccines against this had been made. And so one has to ask the question, if they had successfully made a bioweapon in Barich's lab, or later from 2017 and on, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they had successfully engineered this bioweapon, and the premise was the reason they should be allowed to do this in spite of a moratorium on gain-of-function research is they're going to use this to make vaccines to protect the population. Where was the vaccine research for those 5 or more years? There wasn't any, as far as I know. And that means it was a lie. The whole idea of marketing gain-of-function research so that we'll be ahead of our enemies and we'll be able to have vaccines when we need them was an outright lie, because they never did it. They never raised money to make vaccines against those viruses, and they never submitted grants for it, apparently, and it was nowhere. And given that, you can only assume that the reason for wanting to make these bioterrorism agents is unbridled scientific curiosity without responsibility, or more, I don't know what to say, except just evil inclinations as to be able to have these agents without any ability to push back on them as far as those people knew at the time. So you have to address why we've even been doing this gain-of-function research when, for example, you do your gain-of-function research, you invent a virus, you make a vaccine for that, and then your enemy country says, oh, look what they made. We can just change this, this, and this, and the vaccine will be useless. And so in 3 months, they make a competing bioterrorism agent that your vaccine's already useless. And so where in the world is there a rationale that we should be doing this bioterrorism research when the supposed motivation is really a fraud?
Yeah.
Wow. You also referred to those studies in the early 2000s that were showing that zinc ionophores were effective against coronavirus. Hydroxychloroquine, right, being the leading zinc ionophore. And one of the ironies there is I've got the study up on my computer, but the 2010 study was one of the authors was Ralph Barrick himself, showing that in vitro, in cell cultures, zinc ionophores like hydroxychloroquine were reducing viral replication.
So anybody use Head and Shoulders shampoo? You might know that the active ingredient in that shampoo is zinc pyrithione, and the pyrithione is a zinc ionophore that gets the zinc into the cells that create the dandruff, and that's how its mechanism of action works. Zinc ionophores, there's a large number of agents that do that, and no one should eat Head and Shoulders shampoo to treat COVID. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is one of a number of mechanisms that these medications use to defeat this illness. That's not all that hydroxychloroquine does. In fact, in the Omicron era, we're not even sure that hydroxychloroquine is useful for suppressing viral replication. It has another, perhaps even more important function, which is to suppress the overreaction of the immune system. Remember that viral replication is a flu-like illness that's uncomfortable. Fevers, headaches, muscle aches, tiredness, and so on. Those are all issues of viral replication. And in fact, almost all of those signs and symptoms come about because of the immune system making molecules to combat the virus. And so if the immune system goes on, in some people, the immune system overreacted, and that's what caused the pneumonia. When the immune debris got deposited in the lungs, then those people got hospitalized. Hydroxychloroquine modulates the immune system to keep it from getting to that point. And so in the Omicron era, what personal experience and other people have told me in their experience, hydroxychloroquine is succeeding because of keeping people from getting hospitalized, but it may not keep people from having the viral replication phase, the outpatient discomforts and annoyances of being sick with a flu-like illness. And in fact, it may actually make that flu-like illness last a day or two longer than without it. But what that's doing is it's keeping it from getting into the lungs and keeping it from becoming much more severe. And that's what's important. It's not important, as uncomfortable as it is, it's not important to suppress the symptoms. It's important to suppress hospitalization and mortality. And so hydroxychloroquine has a number of different mechanisms of action, and still important, potentially important in the Omicron years. And ivermectin also has a range of mechanisms of action, and probably that extend into hospital disease as well.
Yeah, well, you had said to me when we met at the Senator Ron Johnson hearing back in December that, in your opinion, the reason that hydroxychloroquine was suppressed wasn't because they were afraid that it didn't work, but because they knew that it did. And what's so startling to me about this trail of published papers is that it shows that people who were the first to the microphone and first to the presses, people like Anthony Fauci, to say that this didn't work or it was just anecdotal, they were the ones who had the evidence in their hands for over 10 years.
Oh, they knew it worked. They know, but they felt their job was to prepare the playing field for expensive agents and vaccines. And they were fully on board with pharma, the corporate government partnership, which we've seen at least broadcasted to us over the last 20 or 30 years, as if to say government can't afford to do everything, so it's going to partner with companies to help research and products come to the marketplace that will be beneficial, basically is totalitarianism. That this is a pick and choose of the government, not a free market system. And I think that we've understood how that totalitarianism has inflicted death and harm on the American population by the government partner forcing the government to suppress competing medications that have dramatic economic benefit compared to the high costs of the patent medications and vaccines. And that control of the playing field, because the medications that were being made as patent medications could not be sold at the price competing on a fair economic playing field with things that already worked. So you already had to suppress those cheap medications, and that was the role that Fauci and others played in the administration to do that, working as agents for pharma and the government, not for the people.
How do medical schools like Yale teach the history of medications like hydroxychloroquine? And what do you know of the history of hydroxychloroquine?
So I'm not involved in the medical school teaching of its medical students. And I think that at most it would have been taught in the context of preventing and treating malaria and in treatment of rheumatoid arthritis and other immune system dysfunction diseases, lupus and so on, where it's been very safe and very effective and used for decades. And what med students need to know is that daily use of this medication for years builds the potential risk of retinitis. And this is why ophthalmologists routinely look for potential retinitis in rheumatoid arthritis patients and similar diseases who they have annual checkups after they've been using the hydroxychloroquine for 5 or more years. A small but non-zero risk builds up over time, and this level of risk does not occur for people who've been using hydroxychloroquine once a week, for example, or daily but for a few weeks. Those risks are essentially zero in that respect.
In the research that I've done, this hydroxychloroquine comes from, chloroquine, which is a more potent version, right? That has a longer half-life.
It's a more toxic version. It has, it's not toxic. It's a safe medication, but the dose has to be maintained a little more carefully. Hydroxychloroquine, by its molecular change, it still has the same clinical functions, and but it's much less toxic, and so it's more preferable to be used for most applications.
And both of the drugs are derivatives of quinine. My understanding is that quinine has a very short lifespan, unlike hydroxychloroquine, which is 22 days half-life?
Well, hydroxychloroquine gets preferentially absorbed into lung tissue, and then it slowly leaches out from the lung tissue into the blood, which supports what's called the terminal half-life. When you take hydroxychloroquine in the stomach, on an empty stomach, it peaks in 3 to 4 hours in the blood. And so you get a very sharp peak of blood levels that goes down pretty sharply also, and then starts to tail off exponentially. And that tail, that whole cycle, is about 90% complete in 24 hours. But if you take two doses, a dose twice a day or a dose the next day, you get these overlapping peaks that build up. And the reason that the tail off occurs and lasts for so long is because some of that in the bloodstream gets into lung cells, and then those lung cells store it, and they gradually release it over time. And so if you build up over 3 to 5 days the doses of taking hydroxychloroquine, it fills up the lungs. And in fact, in early COVID, which had much greater lung involvement than Omicron strain, then that's where you needed the medication the most. And so that's part of why it was so effective in pre-Omicron COVID. And so it builds up, and then it slowly comes out, where half of it decline is down in 22 days, and in some people even longer. And so it's very beneficial. And that's why, in fact, it works for malaria in dosing of once a week, because it builds up in the lungs and slowly comes out. And if you've taken this for 5 or 6 weeks to start with, then you've got enough in the lungs that it maintains levels in the blood that average out to be good for the purposes of preventing malaria. And that's kind of its pharmacology, and it's a very useful drug that way.
But you know, a lot of times I think that we assume that all of our medications come from pills, and we don't appreciate the value of the environment providing solutions.
The main example of that is vitamin D. That everybody should be taking vitamin D until proven otherwise, that people do not get enough vitamin D and sunlight in their lives for optimal immune functioning, and that vitamin D is very cheap and easy to take, and it's a once a day tablet or a large amount taken once a week or even once a month is enough to help people's immune systems. And adequate vitamin D prevents people from getting hospitalized from COVID and probably other infectious respiratory diseases as well.
Well, I have to piggyback a serious question on top of that, because vitamin D was also suppressed, right? So what is your sense of hope or outlook for science and medical science as a practice? Because what we're talking about, it's easy to discuss this. I mean, we're so into the subject that we really discuss it academically, but what we're really talking about is a collusion in a human atrocity of vast proportions. I mean, I have friends who lost parents, right, that probably didn't need to, because these things were suppressed. What is your feeling about, and we haven't even talked yet about, the suppression of the evidence of the adverse reactions to the vaccine, right? I mean, that was horrific. What is your outlook for science as as this thing that has been so dominant in Western society that now seems to have been so corrupted that it is actually a component in, a mass atrocity?
I would refer to it as crimes against humanity.
Okay.
That's right. And crimes against science, for that matter, if you want to think of it that way. That science, as I said, has become a free-for-all where every person has to review every study critically for validity and informativeness and relevance and so on. You can't rely on journals or journal reviewers to do that for you, at least not honestly for the moment. I think that it really is a big problem for science when people can't tell the difference between theories and evidence. And all of the stuff, I've written about this in Brownstone, all the stuff that has been put out to the general public, Fauci claiming I am the science, and so on, is utter nonsense, because plausibility and theories are not science. The definition of science is empirical or observational work to support or refute theories. The theories are the motivation for science, but they're not the science. The empirical work that supports or refutes the science is the science. And it is a huge difference that anybody can make up theories that sound plausible for anything, saying you should stand 6 feet apart and it'll protect people from spreading COVID as a theory. Where's the empirical evidence to support or refute that theory? There is essentially none. And so this is the problem, that these things, because they have technical components, sound, quote, scientific, but they're not scientific, they're technical. And the difference between technical and scientific is the empirical evidence to use to support or refute the theories. And so we've been propagandized on whole bunches of technical things about mask wearing and vaccines and lockdowns, and so on, that were not scientific. They were technical. The bits of scientific evidence on the vaccines and the 2 or 3 relevant studies of masks that show essentially nothing, that were so-called scientific, were flawed science. And so even though that was scientific, they were bad scientific studies, and they've seen lots of criticism. And this has made science a total free-for-all now, or medical science anyway, clinical science now, which has been very damaging because nobody knows what to believe and nobody knows who to trust, if anybody. And I think it's a big problem that was brought on by the zealous interests of collusion between government interests and pharma interests to sell products at all cost to control a population at all costs, and not for the benefit of the population, but for the benefit of the government and the pharma interests.
Do you have any advice for the general public going forward? The average man and woman who may face, the next pandemic or the next sort of situation like this. How do they navigate it? Read
the books written by the people who've been dealing with all these problems. Read Bobby Kennedy's book on Fauci. Read the Bregan's book, that We Are the Prey. Read Malone's book. Read Naomi Wolf's book on other people's bodies. There are lots of books out that have been talking about all of the interference in rational science and freedom that we've taken for granted, documenting all of the interference in the operation of our government as beholden to us rather than ruling us. That this has been a big problem, that the government interest has taken itself as its interest rather than the population interest, and corrupted everything. And the reasons for that corruption you'll get a sense of from reading those books, and they're all available on Amazon, if not other places, and maybe some even in your local library by now. That there is a lot of information out there, and people have to wake up and not read the New York Times and the Washington Post and think that they're getting objective evidence when they're not. The what I call state-controlled media, that includes a lot of the social media and the legacy media, are not objective reporters. The Reuters and AP and so on are not objective reporters. It's not fringe to have different contrarian, so to speak, understandings of reality, of what's happened to us. And people have to wake up and understand that if they start asking questions about all of this, what we've faced and dealt with for the last 3.5 years has not been rational. It's been inflicted on us, and it's not rational. And because of its irrationality, people have to see, well, if it's not rational, then why did we experience it? Who forced us to experience it? And what were their motivations and why? Just keep asking questions. Keep looking for answers and entertain reasons why things made sense that weren't necessarily in the obvious, simple way that's been told to us by government proclamations. These vaccines are safe and effective. The waves will be caused by unvaccinated people. All of the unvaccinated people don't deserve medical care. All of these public messages that have been put on the population, one can see now, were false. And you have to ask, once you recognize that they were false, why were we being told these false messages by official government actors? And so that is what people need to explore and come to their own conclusions, Read the medical evidence. I've written, other people have written the medical evidence about hydroxychloroquine, about ivermectin, about the vaccines. There is a lot out there. You have to look harder to find it because New York Times won't talk about it, and Washington Post won't talk about it, and they'll only deride it as fringe theories and conspiracy theories and all of that, which is just utter nonsense. That labeling something is irrelevant. It's what the something says is important, and one has to make sense of what things say and not be called names over it. And once you do that, you'll see that there's been a lot more going on than just somehow a virus got to us and our government helped us to survive it, which it didn't.
Well, you're talking about journals. One of the things that I'm working on right now is a Freedom of Information Act request against, or not against, but just of the records from a man named Eric Freed, who works for National Cancer Institute, and he's also the editor-in-chief of MDPI viruses. The NIH rejected 490 pages of documents, refused to release any of them, that are the review process, basically, of how they chose to put to force a retraction of a paper or a study that had said that there was a link between the spike protein in the vaccine and P53 related cancers. Just to try to get the understanding of how and why they chose to put out this expression of concern, which led to the retraction. I submitted this FOIA request, and it's apparently unusual the way they rejected all of it. So I have submitted an appeal, and apparently there's another agency or department of the government that is keenly interested in the determination of my appeal. And the person involved in who signed the sheet of paper that I got, or the document that I got from the NIH, she formerly represented NSA, CDC, and NSA, CIA, DOD, DOJ.
Is that Avril Haines?
No, this one was something Williams. I forget her first name. So I've done this article about this, and this is kind of an exploding thing. What do you know about MDPI and MDPI viruses, if anything?
Nothing. But the fact that this is going so high in the government means that they're seeing a threat, and you'll probably have to go to court over it. And you'll be fighting, and they'll eventually release it, and they will redact whole pages, making absurd claims, and you'll have to go back to court to say this is absurd, that the only things that need to be redacted are either trade secrets or people's names and email addresses.
Right. And their argument was that releasing the pages or the documents would expose trade secrets of their review process. And my argument was that MDPI is a Swiss-based nonprofit, and that based on the topic at hand, and apparently the study has been validated by a study that came out of NIAID in end of 2022. So it's urgent that we understand if there is a causal link to cancers from this vaccine, people should know about that.
Well, the paper was out, but later retracted. That means that the paper is available. It's probably on the Wayback Machine.
No, it still exists. It just has a big retracted thing on it. But one of the authors refused to retract. So it was published, and then a month later, an expression of concern was written by Eric and some guy named Oliver Shiljan in Europe, and then there was a 6-month campaign of pressure tactics against these two authors to force them to retract. One caved, and then ultimately lost his permanent full-time position with a university in Sweden. So it's unusual. I mean, have you ever heard of that kind of forced retraction?
Yes, it's happening everywhere. And in fact, I know of an ivermectin paper that's a valid paper that was retracted because the editor of the journal said that this was not a research study because it was done in Mexico, where the government of Mexico provided ivermectin doses across a large fraction of Mexico City. And so they were able to compare people who got the ivermectin with the month before the program, people who didn't get ivermectin, the 2-month period, for a comparison of the benefits of ivermectin and against COVID. And so the journal said, this didn't go to an institutional review board, therefore it was unethical, therefore we're retracting it. Oh, and by the way, this is a medical paper and we're not a medical journal, so therefore we're retracting it. And they made a few more absurd assertions about this, none of which criticized the scientific content of the paper. And so you can see that the editor was being forced to do this and coming up with all these fake reasons, and fake reasons all sound plausible, but they're all fake. This is what I was saying, that plausibility is brazen today. People make all sorts of absurd, plausible statements and are brazen in thinking that they get away with it and that people believe all this stuff. So they make a bunch of absurd but plausible statements and then retract the paper. And but the bottom line is the paper is retracted, and it's not like the editor who did that or the publisher who did that has egg all of his face and has to resign because of the stupidity of everything he said in the retraction. They get away with it because they're employed by somebody whose interest is being served by the retraction.
Zero Hedge had an article that came out, and it may have been part of Epic Times, but it showed that even despite its retraction, the Surgisphere paper has been cited a significant number of times since retraction. So it's the lie that keeps going, and it's been regurgitated by all these other people to validate their fraud.
Well, there's an even bigger lie about it, which is that it purported to study hospital patients and therefore is completely irrelevant for outpatients. As I said, hospital disease is a completely different severe pneumonia than outpatient viral replication, which is a flu-like illness. The treatments are utterly, completely different. And the fact that a drug would or would not work in hospital patients is irrelevant to its usage in outpatients. And yet the Surgisphere paper is being quoted to say hydroxychloroquine doesn't work in outpatients when it didn't study outpatients in the first place. So whether or not it's fake data, it's completely irrelevant.
Are you familiar with groups like Team Halo and Shots Heard Around the World? So there are nonprofits that in some instances are owned and funded by defense contractors in Europe that then go out and they find these young up-and-coming doctors and make them TikTok stars. And their job is to go out and fight, misinformation or disinformation. But what they're actually doing is harassing and filing complaints against medical license boards, against doctors that speak out publicly, or physician's assistants, nurses, anyone that says something that goes counter to the pharma message. This is happening, and we've been doing a lot of work investigating these groups, and it's very unfortunate, but they go all the way through the government. They go to all of our major corporations, and in some instances, it seems highly politically motivated. I don't even really have a question. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the pandemic was never a political question, but it was used for political benefit as soon as it was recognized that it could be. And that's colored a lot of the response. And the government now, which is highly one-party controlled, and certainly in the bureaucratic parts of the government is essentially one-party functioning, is corrupted everything, virtually everything about all of this. And the fact that there are bot armies doing all of the social media stuff run by AI using the same terminology that makes it look like there are hordes, of influencers doing all this stuff when it's all propaganda and information warfare has been going on. And the fact that the medical licensing boards and the AMA and so on. These are all corrupted by pharma influence as well. It's just, it's a whole corrupt society. What it's shown is that our educational institutions, through the professional schools, have not provided people with the ability to make sense of things, only to follow scripts that are provided to them about how to conduct science, investigation, thought, critical reasoning, and so on. They don't do that. And and even if they could, they're not allowed to because of the financial interests that are so obscene, that are controlling such a large fraction of our intellectual sphere. And that's why basically it's our dissident startups like Brownstone, like Wellness, like others who are pushing back, because we are just not going to take this level of propaganda control of our country, which had democratic origins of natural human rights that we are not going to give up without a fight.
I was going to show this interview that you did with CNN, but we're running a little long. I don't want to take up all your day. But you know the one I'm talking about, right? With the one with John Berman, I believe it's.
Oh,
Berman.
yes. Yes. That's so old news. And in fact, I've already spoken about the randomized trials and the fraud of claiming that they're automatically good evidence, which had been, in fact, that question had been percolating around in my mind for since about 5 years ago, when I was teaching a course to our Yale epidemiology students and a few law students also, a course called Litigational Epidemiology, which is basically epidemiology about drugs and vaccines and medical devices, how one understands them when epidemiologists work as experts in legal cases and causal reasoning and so on. And I started thinking about randomized trials and their evidentiary basis, and realized, had an epiphany, that if randomized trials don't have enough outcome events, then the randomization isn't working well enough. And that's what got me to thinking about why randomized trials were not automatically good evidence. And I didn't say that at the time in the Berman CNN interview, but it had kind of been subconscious for me in my teaching at that point, and came out more when I finally put pen to paper for the article in Brownstone last November, I think, on plausibility.
I'll read out what the lower third under the video was so snarky. It says, while you're beating John Berman, by the way, who is, I think, a Harvard-trained actor.
Right.
You're beating him over the head with facts. And here this lower third pops up, and I'll put this in the edit. It says, Yale epidemiologist insists against evidence hydroxychloroquine works.
Why haven't any random placebo-controlled trials showed benefit? And isn't that a problem for an epidemiologist?
No. In fact, the FDA has a huge history of drugs going into widespread use in the medical community for decades that have not been established on the basis of randomized controlled trials. Half of the chemotherapy drugs used in cancer were used without randomized controlled trials. The antibiotics, amoxicillin, for example, that parents use with their children all the time, day in, day out, was never established with a randomized controlled trial before it was used. We have a whole vast medical literature that was not the standard. So why is it suddenly the standard now?
Right, against all evidence, against conspiracy theory, against all evidence.
It was such an unbelievable thing. And I think one of the questions he asked was, why should we believe you over Dr. Anthony Fauci, who probably hasn't treated any patients in how long?
Well, Fauci hasn't provided any evidence, and I provided the 5 studies that are the totality of evidence at that time point. By the way, there's 9 studies now, much larger ones, and all show exactly the same benefit of hydroxychloroquine in outpatients.
You brought up randomized control trials just a minute ago, and there's a burning question I have that may be helpful to medical students and historians of science. As I understand it, in the 1980s, I think right around 1983, one of the things that was pivotal in the genesis or the origin of the randomized randomization being the gold standard, was the fact that at the time they were, the individual who researched this found that certain medical interventions for maladies of the back or spine that were being surgically treated, what they found was that doctors were subconsciously preferencing patients to have the selective procedure because probably subconsciously they were recognizing that they were more healthy or fit. And when you randomized it and then took out the subjective preferential, moving, application of the treatment, then they found out it wasn't having an effect at all. And that seems to then have been applied. And I want to know if I'm right on this, and if this would be helpful to me. It seems to me that this has been misapplied, right? Because I can understand where an individual might subconsciously preference something. But when you've got, say, an epidemic, and different doctors in nursing homes are giving a therapy, and this epidemic is striking at random, right, by its very nature, and or according to certain patterns that are not being controlled by human preference, right? And then you're giving a therapeutic that then has enormous effects, so that one nursing home has 80% survival rate or higher, while others are decimated. Isn't this is this a misapplication? Am I right that really that's not what randomization is designed to do, to overcome, say, clinical observations?
So randomization, in theory, can be good evidence if the numbers are large enough so that the number of outcome people in the treatment and the control groups are large, more than 50 or 100 in each of those groups. Then the randomization will generally work. If it's done properly, it'll work, and it will remove all potential biases, both measurable and unmeasurable. However, in COVID, in treatment, in the outpatient treatment studies, the claim is that somehow patients who take these medications by choice are somehow different, and that biases the results of the non-randomized but controlled studies. However, if you look at those studies, you'll see that people who took hydroxychloroquine in these controlled studies were more likely to be sicker. That means that they had more chronic conditions and other reasons that show that they would have a harder time getting better than the people who didn't take the hydroxychloroquine. And what that means is that there was a hurdle to show efficacy of the study. If the people taking the drug are sicker, it's biasing the result away from showing benefit. And yet the hydroxychloroquine studies still show that the people who took that had reduced risk of hospitalization and mortality compared to the people who didn't take hydroxychloroquine. So there is some bias in those studies, but the bias is against showing benefit of the drug. And really, what we've learned is empirically that modern epidemiologic studies that are controlled but not randomized are essentially as good as randomized trials. This is shown empirically in a study by Engelmeyer and colleagues that was published in 2014 by the Cochrane Library Commission, which is a group that studies randomized trials in the UK. And what they did is they did a meta-analysis, a combined analysis of 11 other meta-analyses, each of which had hundreds or thousands of studies comparing randomized trials to their non-randomized counterparts. And what they showed is in these more recent studies stemming from the 1980s and especially 1990s and 2000s, that there was only an 8% difference in the result between the randomized studies and the non-randomized but controlled studies. And so the idea here is that early in the 1960s and 70s, we didn't know much about chronic diseases. We didn't know much about their causes. We didn't measure a lot of things. And therefore, non-randomized studies could come up with different results in the randomized trials. But in the 1990s, we had already learned a lot about these chronic diseases and measured everything in the world in our non-randomized trials and adjusted for them statistically in analyses so that we could control for all these distorting, potentially confounding factors. And that's why in the more recent, what I call modern epidemiologic controlled studies, those studies do about as well as the randomized trials, and why they have to be taken as seriously, if not more so, than randomized trials that could have small numbers of outcome events and therefore randomization didn't work. And those studies, in fact, didn't measure all these other things and didn't control for them and should have, because their numbers of outcome events were too small. And so you basically are at the level of having to understand the whole repertoire of scientific evidence and amass it and evaluate it subjectively, perhaps, of all these different kinds of studies, and evaluate each study for its strengths and weaknesses, and evaluate the whole literature and drawing conclusions, and not just assume that any one kind of a study is a gold standard study. It's not.
Well, which is all to your point about medicine needs to get away from this idea of scripts or a oversimplified kind of trump card system where you say, well, this is a randomized clinical trial, so it trumps this other evidence automatically. We don't even need to look at the evidence.
That's right. That's exactly the point. That is propaganda. That's not a scientific statement, because all the reasons that I've said, the science shows that only applies if there are very large numbers of outcome events in the study, and most randomized trials don't have those numbers because they're not designed to reduce confounding. They're designed to see a statistical benefit, meaning if you can show a 50% benefit in using your drug, then you're not going to include 1 million people in the study. You're going to include 40,000, because that might be enough to show the level of benefit that you want to see, but that's not enough to reduce this confounding problem. And so they're never designed to reduce that.
Well, what you're saying is very significant. You're saying that there's a preference to the smaller numbers because you can show benefit for your big pharma donor or a benefactor, right? In other words, you through the small numbers actually use the randomized control study to offset the actual science.
That is correct.
Is that right?
And we know there's a whole history, of malfeasance in randomized trials. It goes back 30 plus years. Dealing with pharma and its effort to control the approval and marketing of its medications.
One last question for me, if you don't, two really. One, are you seeing any increase in actual cancers cases potentially linked? We can't say that they're necessarily linked to the vaccine, but are you or oncologists that you know or anyone seeing an increase?
There have been reports of what's being called turbo cancer. I think this is hard to know just yet. New cancers, solid cancers, take 4 or 5 years or more to develop. The blood cancers like leukemias, lymphomas, 2 to 3 years to develop from scratch, from the initial cell that gets transformed into a cancer and then grows into a larger cancer. The solid cancers take longer. So we're not quite at the point from after the vaccines or after COVID to be able to see much of anything yet if it had arisen de novo. That having been said, the vaccines, and maybe COVID too to some degree, has an effect on the immune system and our immune surveillance that sees that cancer cells become foreign to the body, and our immune systems detect them and destroy those cells when they're individual cells that are starting up. And if the immune system gets damaged and can't do that, it lets cancers that have started already continue to grow. And this also applies to cancers that may be in remission. And one of the things about breast cancer is that a lot of cases of women in their 50s and 60s get breast cancer, are adequately treated. They go into remission. We don't know whether they're cured or not, but then 20 years later, they come out of remission for some reason because those cells have been hiding in places in the body where the treatments didn't quite get to them. And but they're quiescent. And so after that, if the vaccines somehow stimulate those cells to start multiplying again, then the cancers come out of remission much sooner than they might have later on in life. And so what may be happening is we are seeing cancers occurring that appear to be arising quickly, but may be from cancers that already existed, but were not detectable because the immune system was battling to get rid of them or keep them in check. And whether they would have been cancers in 5 or 10 years down the road, we don't really know. Nevertheless, there are apparent increases in those kinds of cancers. Oncologists are seeing this. Pathologists are seeing this. We don't have a clear connection yet into how the vaccines might be doing this, but there is increasing evidence, and we have to be watching that.
And by solid tumors, would that include brain tumors?
Brain tumors come about as both brain tumors and as metastases from tumors in prostate, breast, other organs.
All right. Did you ever work with SV40, or do you have? Okay.
No.
Yeah, that's one of the other areas we've been researching was SV40 and the government's unbelievable experimentation to weaponize it. There was something called MK Naomi, which was operated out of Fort Detrick, which is where they weaponized cancer.
Well, it would be kind of stupid to weaponize cancer because nobody wants a gun that shoots bullets that takes 20 years to reach their victims.
Well, what they did was, according to Judith Ferry Baker, they were doing gain-of-function research out of Tulane, or near Tulane, with Alton Oshner. And then her research, well, they would inject neonatal mice with SV40. They would grow tumors. They would bombard them with particle beam radiation, and then cut the tumors off, liquefy them, re-inject them into other mice, repeat the process until the most virulent tumors were created. Then they would move up the chain of animals like to marmosets and whatever else. Apparently her research then went to MD Anderson, which then went to Fort Detrick, which just happens to be where Eric Fried works, the guy for the National Cancer Institute. But what we found were that people that worked in cancer research, supposedly to fight cancer, were weaponizing it. And this was to make a weapon to kill Castro. And she said that they had it at the point where she got it. They were at the point where they needed to start experimenting on prisoners to see if it would kill them in 30 days. But with animals, they were killing animals in 30 days with tumors, monkeys and such. So
I don't know. Talk about mad scientists. We have mad government scientists. It's pretty scary.
Well, Judith, she was as a teenager doing experiments where she was taking, I think she had what do you call it, germline mice?
Yeah, immunocompromised mice.
Right, and so she would get these particular mice, and then she would inject SV40 in them and grow tumors, and then she could take that tumor and do what she did and inject it into other mice and create tumors, and that's how she was discovered by Oshner as this mad scientist teenager. But that's all documented in Dr. Mary's Monkey, which is interesting book. Anyway, thank you so much. Clinton, do you have any other questions?
Well, I do. One last question. At the beginning of the whole rollout of the vaccine, Professor Dr. Sukarit Bhakti in Germany had predicted the rise in cancers based on how the vaccine would engage with the lymphatic system. And he also predicted a rise in things like tuberculosis among tuberculosis endemic populations, since it would be the lymphatic system, I suppose, that it suppresses the tuberculosis in those populations. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any idea if that prediction is true, when we would start seeing that happen?
Well, we've seen a few studies now that have looked at repeated dosing of the mRNA vaccines to show that the immunoglobulin antibody response to the challenge to the vaccinated people by the infection normally it causes an IgG, which is one class of antibody molecule, which attacks the cells that have the virus on them, or the virus itself. And what happens is, as you give more and more doses of the vaccine to an individual, these studies show that the class of the IgG molecule becomes what's called IgG4, which is a non-attacking kind of antibody, but what's called a tolerance antibody, meaning that it allows the covering of the viral particle or the cell with the virus on the outside to protect that virus or cell from attack by other parts of the immune system, meaning that it allows those invaders to stay in the body and do what they do in their disease without being crippled by the immune system. That's what tolerance means. Tolerance is common in the immune system for things like allergies. If we didn't have immune tolerance, then every time we would, every spring, we'd all be sneezing and have runny noses and have allergies to everything in the world. And so we have a certain degree of immune tolerance that's built up as part of our immune system. The immune system is able to tell what are the things that are safe to be tolerant over and what are the things you have to attack vociferously, strongly. And so what's happening is with the vaccines that these papers are showing that giving the vaccines 4, 5, 6 times is building up tolerance to the infection rather than attack of the infection. And to the degree that this tolerance extends to similar organisms or other aspects that the immune system would normally attack but is now becoming tolerant to, it could lead to allowing other infections to become more operational in people who are exposed to them, as opposed to being fought by the immune system, which is the natural way that tuberculosis and other infections would normally be fought by the immune system.
Wow. Thank you. Well, this has been tremendous.
Yeah. Dr. Risch, thank you for everything. Thank you for coming on this show, and thank you for being an